was born in 1972 in Memphis, Tennessee. We lived in Raleigh-Fraser area on Hollywood Street, and my grandparents lived a couple of blocks away, my dad's parents. We spent a lot of time, my older brother and I, at my grandmother's and my grandfather's house, who just lived right around the corner. They were a big influence in my life. Fine Christian people. We would go over there on Saturdays and spend the night, and I can just remember us sitting at the piano and my grandmother playing the piano, and they would always take us to Sunday school the next morning, and my parents would come to church and meet us there, and then all of us would always go back after church and go back to their house, and we'd eat Sunday dinner. We did buy a house and moved to Wyatt, Mississippi, and that was in September of my first grade year. After we moved to Wyatt, we really didn't know anybody in this community, and my grandparents knew some people that lived in somewhere else in Tate County, and they had invited us to go to church. So we did start going to church over there, and it was a church that was growing and thriving, and lots of kids there. So we got involved in church, and it wasn't long, my mother, and she also has the gift of singing, and so she started participating in the choir, and not long after was asked to sing in a group. And for whatever reason, we would go, and she would go to practice at one of the ladies' houses, and so we would go over there. One of the ladies' husbands asked my mom, could I go and check the cows with him? And so my mom agreed, and he had a couple of pastures where he would go and check cows, but one particular was near the house, and it was a great big barn, and we would go down there to check the cows, and he had in the barn a freezer that he kept the feed in, and so he would set me up on the freezer. And at first it started just him, setting me up there, and him doing his chores and feeding the cows and that kind of thing, and eventually led up to him getting closer and closer to me. And each time I went and for my mom to practice, he got more and more in my space, and eventually did things to me that no grown-up had any business doing to a child. When I was probably in the fifth grade, my mom sat down with me to talk to me, just as any mom would, to kind of tell you, have that little daughter-mother talk. And she had asked me if I'd ever been touched in any way inappropriate, and my response was yes. And that was when the moment that pretty much everybody found out that had happened to me. I didn't go and get any counseling, and it was really never discussed with my family. And that was the beginning of my preteen years. And so those years were hard. I had a low self-esteem. I didn't feel good about myself. I thought I was ugly and fat and all the things I guess teenage girls go through. And during that time, I just had a hard time with relationships. When I was 15 years old, I met a young man, and he was older than I was, and just had a different lifestyle than I did. He came from a broken home, was around alcohol, and was pretty much given a whole lot more freedom to go and do what he would like to go do. I graduated high school, I went to college, and was supposed to move in the dorm, and it wasn't long after I moved into the dorm that I moved out of the dorm and in with my boyfriend. Through that whole relationship, my parents and I had a very strained relationship. We fought, and they knew what he was, but I wasn't willing to see. At that point in my life, I knew that I had to make a change, or something was going to happen to myself. And so I decided, for whatever reason, to join the Army. And it was just probably a few short months, and I left and went to basic training. And so I finished basic training, and I did find a lot of pride in doing that. And I graduated and went straight to AIT. While I was in AIT, I found out that I had cervical cancer. After that, I went on and finished AIT and came home. I had signed up for National Guard, so I came home. But I came home to that pretty much same mindset, and still was very confused and looking for that relationship that I had knew was not what I needed. So after that, I decided to go and sign up for regular Army, and I left and went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And that's where I was there for a while, and just still having those same thoughts and low self-esteem issues, and thoughts of the past, and just willingness to do whatever I had to do to please people, or thoughts to be loved. It wasn't long, and I found out that I was expecting my first child. The Army offers you to take an early out at this point, and so I did decide to come back home. Soon got to a point where I was antsy just being at the house doing nothing, and so I got a opportunity for a job. Reconnected with someone that also worked there that I was friends with in high school. We started, like I said, dating, and several months after that, I found out that I was expecting again another child. Some of the ladies from church had started a class for unwed mothers and for single parents, and so one of the ladies at White had invited me to come to be a part of this class. And so I did. I started to come to the class, and just embarrassed of, I had already had one son, and then I was pregnant with my second son. It was hard for me. Just the realization of what I had done, and who I was, and the embarrassment. And I wasn't really even embarrassed for me. I was more embarrassed for my children. One particular Sunday, I can remember the preacher telling the story of Matthew, and Matthew being a tax collector, and how tax collectors were the most hated men during that biblical time. And the one thing that stands out the most about that was what Matthew said, that he'd never had a friend like Jesus. And so at that point, it became very real to me of what I needed and who I needed to fill that void in my life. I realized in that one moment that, for one, I had never forgiven myself for the things that I had done. And for God to do that, I mean, that was just the biggest deal. And so I did. I did walk the aisle that day, and that changed my life. And I know that 7 years, when I was 7 years old, the devil planted that seed of unworthiness in my life, and it went on for years of mental abuse, low self-esteem, and just whispers of the devil in my ear. And in that moment, God gave me, He washed me white as snow. So in July of 1994, I was saved. And then in November of 94, my second child was born, Caleb. God used those two little boys to teach me something that I never knew. I'm so glad that that's what He gave me to teach me. I was introduced to a young man who was a brother to a coworker that I worked with. And we became friends, and I would go over to her house where he lived with her and just play board games and laugh and have a good time. And really never thought about him as anything other than a friend. And but he kept doing things for me, and he would show up at the house and leave me gifts on the porch, and show up at a ball game where I was playing church softball or things like that. And one day I was driving home from work, and God spoke to me and said, "He's the one." And knowing my stubborn self that I am, I argued and said, "Are you kidding me?" And He said, "No, he's the one." And so just a few short months later in July, we were married. He took my boys under his wing, and immediately, even before we had gotten married, my sons were calling him Daddy. And it wasn't something that I spurred them on to do, or he did. It just became natural. And so I don't know which came first. He loved my kids or he loved me, but after we got married, we were a family. being the hard-headed and stubborn person I was, arguing with God and saying, but God, you know I can't. And he said, Paula, but you can. And all of a sudden, this breeze just started blowing. And in that moment, I knew that it was time to tell my story. But first I had to get right with my children, and I had to tell them my story first. And so during that time, my husband was coming to a different service than I was at church. We had 2 services because I was working and had to be at work early. And so I didn't realize that he was kind of going through his own battle. And I went to him and told him that it was time that I needed to sit down and tell our children. And it was hard for me to, and embarrassing, and to tell my children who I was before God changed me and saved me. And my husband came to me and said that he hadn't been being the husband and the father that he knew God wanted him to be. And so that was a turning point in both of our marriage. And so we called a family meeting with my children, and we sat down and told them everything. And God gave me the strength and the wisdom and the words to do that. And my oldest son got up and said, I just got one thing to say. You've always been my daddy, and you'll always be my daddy. And so what I thought was going to be this big deal ended up making us closer and loving on Dale. And he needed it right when he needed it. So God's timing was perfect in that. And so I knew through that this was what I was supposed to do. And after telling my family, this great thing was lifted from me. I felt like this big weight that was holding me back all these years. And I didn't feel like that I was glorifying God with my testimony. There were times that I did share my testimony with people, but it was generally strangers and people that I knew couldn't tell my children my secret. And so that was the moment that really changed it for me. I'm Paula Kile, and God's grace is definitely enough.